Welcome to The Unusual History of Everything, the podcast that uncovers the unusual history of everything around us. I'm Karen Lacey.
And I'm Melanie Dellis. On this episode, we explore the ancient origins of a modern funeral tradition, as well as the strange history of eating someone's sins.
Death and burial rituals have been part of the human existence since the beginning. What that has looked like and still looks like varies depending on the culture, time period, and location. One ancient tradition still in practice by many cultures is the wake. Today, when we have a wake, at least with most Americans, the body lies in a room at a funeral home, and the friends and family come and go all day for a day or two, paying their respects, which is then followed by a funeral and burial. But that isn't how wakes began. In fact, they were much different and held for much different reasons.
But first, let's talk about why we call it a wake in the first place. The word wake evolved from Old English and Proto-Germanic words that mean to observe or to stand guard. Fitting, since the whole reason for a wake in ancient times for many cultures was to defend the helpless body from any potential evil spirits ready to take it over and cause havoc. So there, friends and family sat, guarding the body until they could bury it, ready to do battle with anything untoward that might come along.
And so it was for centuries until Christianity came along and people became slightly less superstitious, but only slightly. England's tradition of holding a wake over a corpse stems from the Celts, and when the church became involved with saving their souls, prayers were added. Here's how they traditionally held a wake over a corpse in England and Scotland. A plate of salt would be placed on the body's chest to soak up their sins, and then the body would be placed under a table that held the bottles of alcohol for people keeping watch. This tradition of salt and sin carried over to the New World and survives today in many American households. Although the salt isn't placed on the dead body, it's placed in the room where the person died in order to rid the air of any sins. Sort of like burning sage. Anyway, back to the tables of alcohol. As you can probably guess, this turned into more of a drunken prayer circle as they prayed for the soul of the deceased. When in the 16th century, the Reformation forced people in Europe to stop saying prayers for the dead, wakes in England began to fizzle out. But in Ireland, it was another story.
Irish wakes are celebrations of life, not death. In fact, the Irish celebrate 3 birthdays: their birth, their baptism, and the day someone dies and enters the kingdom of heaven, which is said to be their 3rd birthday. Having its history deeply rooted in paganism, Irish wakes are celebrations that can go on for many days, depending on how old the person was. There are also certain superstitions that needed to be handled before the wake can begin and end. For example, if the person dies in their home, someone needs to go around and stop all the clocks at the exact time of that death. That way, when the mourners come in, they will see the time of death and can pay their respects accordingly. The other superstition that is very important is to turn all the mirrors around so the glass is against the wall. The Irish believe mirrors are gateways to other worlds, and that if the deceased person's soul sees a mirror, it will go into it and become trapped and thus never making it to heaven. I think a lot of cultures have that superstition about the mirrors.
They do. And
don't the Jewish people also have that superstition after
yes.
a person dies? They cover the mirrors up?
Yes, and it doesn't always have to be like completely flipping the mirrors either. Some cultures just put black cloth over all mirrors and reflective surfaces because sometimes it's like it is trapping them, but it's also not giving them a window into the world as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember reading something at some point recently that where if you're not supposed to have a TV in your bedroom because when it's off, it's like considered to be black glass, which allows demons.
It's like a mirror.
Which allows demons to come in and like get you while you're sleeping. And there's a TV right there, black glass right next to Karen right now.
See, I don't have a TV in my bedroom. You have a mirror. You have 2 mirrors and a TV in your bedroom.
I have 3 mirrors.
3?
2 mirrors. Yeah, I can't count now. 2 mirrors and a black glass TV. And just so all you listeners know, we record from my bedroom in San Diego. Now you know.
It offers the best, like, space.
Acoustics, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Space and acoustics. Nothing fancy for us, I tell you.
Well, our equipment's pretty fancy.
Yeah, our equipment's fancy. We're fancy. But the room isn't fancy. It's not like a studio, you see.
Yeah, we don't need it. This is more fun.
Yeah.
It's more us.
It totally is.
Well, during the various pandemics and epidemics in our world's history, the fear of evil spirits possessing dead bodies and souls getting trapped in mirrors was replaced with the fear of being buried alive. Turns out, some of the sicknesses had a habit of making you look dead when in fact you were really alive, just with a very slow, faint pulse. People in the 1700s figured this out after several people in England were discovered buried alive in their coffins. They began having wakes in earnest once again, but this time it was to wait a few days and watch for signs of decomposition so that they could make sure the person was really dead.
Oh, God. During the cholera epidemics in the 18th and 19th centuries, some inventors decided to create a coffin that would allow the person inside to contact the people above ground if they woke up and discovered that they had accidentally been buried. One such inventor was Franz Vester. I don't know why I'm laughing because it's really a good idea.
Oh, no, it's a great idea considering what was going
weird.
on.
It just sounds weird like now. Okay, one such inventor was Franz Vester, who in August 1868 got a patent for an improved burial case. In the patent papers, he describes the coffin as having several industrious features, including an air inlet, a ladder, and, quote, if the person is too weak to ascend by the ladder, he can ring a bell, giving the desired alarm for help, and thus save himself from premature death by being buried alive, end quote. Another one was invented by John Krichbaum in 1882 for a device for indicating live in buried persons. That sounds weird, but that's what the patent says. This one had a sort of motion sensor inside in case the person woke up and started freaking out. The sensor was a T-shaped pipe that the dead person's hands, I should say the quote-unquote dead person's hands, were placed on before burial. This pipe travels through the coffin, up through the ground, and out to the air. If they wake up, their hands will automatically move the pipe, which will then allow air to flow in. Kind of like a hand crank.
So crazy. I would say that it's going to be hard to potentially bury that person and make sure that you don't get any dirt or soil into the pipe.
Well, we're not, no one's saying that these things were successful inventions. We just pick a few that sound interesting. But, honestly, I don't even know if I couldn't find anything that said that they worked really well or that it ever worked on a live person. I couldn't find any of that.
I think it was just the fear of it, and it didn't happen as often. Because remember, sometimes they thought that people were buried alive, and the reality was they were just
they were vampires.
They were vampires.
Is that what you were going to say?
I was going to say. I didn't mean they were like actual vampires, but it's also what they thought of as vampires.
Yeah.
Like it was basically their skin had shrunk as part of like decomposition, and everything looked like it was longer, like the hair and the nails.
We have a great podcast about that one.
We do.
What did we call that one? Was that our vampire one?
Yeah, the Vampires in Venice.
Vampires in Venice. Yeah, we talk all about that. And it's actually some pretty cool stuff about decomp.
Yeah, so a lot of times they thought the people were buried alive, and the reality is they really weren't.
Yeah.
Another fun one is from 1885 by Charles Schuyler and Frederick Born-Traeger. Their burial casket takes all the bells and whistles, literally, from previous designs and improves upon them. For example, their motion sensor triggers a clockwork-driven fan that provides air. There's also a battery-powered alarm. According to the patent, quote, when the hand is moved, the exposed part of the wire will come in contact with the body, completing the circuit between the alarm and the ground to the body in the coffin, end quote. The alarm will sound. My favorite part is what happens after that. There's a spring-loaded rod that will raise up carrying feathers and shoot the feathers out so that people will know someone's in there. Sort of like a 19th century emergency flare.
Walking in the cemetery. Right. And all of a sudden these feathers go poosh. And you're like, what the hell?
Right.
And what are you supposed to do? You got to start digging, right?
Right.
Get that person out of there.
Another pretty cool thing that they did was put a wide tube over the dead person's face, which goes up through the coffin and dirt and up to the ground level. Why, you may wonder? Simple. If someone above ground thought the person might be alive, they can put a small lamp down the tube to illuminate the dead person's face and see if they are.
Now, this one was really odd to me because two things. In order to get a small lamp, like even a small lamp in that time period, they were not small. So like the opening of this tube had to literally be at least the size of your face, right? So that's a pretty big opening to have all the way up 6 feet, up through the ground. Okay. And then you've got this really large, wide opening in this tube. Now, aren't birds and bugs and all these things going to go in there?
I was thinking of like these animals
and
like
rain.
Falling down, the rain, and then like the decomp in that area, like around the bodies.
The animals that are
going
to go in that tube and eat things like the rats and stuff.
Gross.
I mean, I don't see how that
there's
works.
there's some problems
There's some major
obviously
problems.
with this.
Now imagine that the person is alive in there. And they're like, oh my God, I'm alive, but thankfully, I've got this tube on my face. I can see this guy. I just need somebody to hear me yell or see my feathers shoot out.
And then a
or whatever.
raccoon falls down the tube.
And then starts eating your face and scratching your eyes out. Like,
gross.
that's horrible.
Yeah.
It's horrible. Whoever thought of that. Charles and Frederick, that was not... I don't know about that one.
It was improved upon with the feathers, at least, because a lot of these ones are like, oh yeah, you can keep breathing and you can move the pipe, but what if no one's there?
Yeah.
You know, like you need someone to be alerted to come to the cemetery, because it's not like cemeteries are populated
That's what
day
the
and
feathers
night.
are for.
Yeah.
But only for a second. You got to be there at the exact moment
so what
the
if-
feathers shoot out.
I know, and that's the other problem with the feather thing. Well, I mean, but if you walk by, you can be like, oh, there were feathers over here. But what if it's like the middle of the night? You're not supposed to know what time it is. So you release your feathers,
Yeah.
and then you have to wait because no one's there. But like, is there like a secondary feather source so you can like, and tells you to wait 20 minutes or something? You know what I mean? Like,
It's all about timing.
it's all about
and
timing.
luck.
Definitely. Like, just hope that somebody's walking by the cemetery.
I think that the most successful version that I've seen in movies work, at least, and I'm going to, talk about The Nun, the movie The Nun, is the bell thing. Mm-hmm. That seems to be the one that makes the most sense, and easily you can ring that bell for 24 hours until somebody gets
Exactly.
to
The
you.
bell makes the most sense.
That
'cause
makes
you can
the most
hear
sense.
that from far away.
Hopefully there's an air source. In The Nun, I didn't see any tubes or anything, but I wasn't looking for it. But
You have a certain amount of air with you trapped in the coffin, but it only lasts for so long.
oh my God. All right, let's get back to that whole salt on the dead man's chest sucking up sin thing we mentioned earlier at the wakes. Up until the early 20th century, some people in Europe chose the career path of a sin eater. Sin eaters were big at wakes and funerals in England, Scotland, and Wales from at least the 1600s. Basically, when someone died, the family would hire a person to come to the wake and take away the deceased person's sins. This would happen by the sin eater putting a cup of wine and a piece of bread on the dead body's chest, which would soak up the sins. Then he or she would mumble a prayer, eat the bread, and drink the wine, upon which the sin eater would stand up and declare the dead person sin-free.
The family who hired the sin eater would pay them 4 pence, which was hardly anything. However, because the people who took this type of job were usually penniless, that 4 pence, a piece of bread, some wine, all for the low cost of their immortal soul looked pretty good. But because they took on all the dead people's sins, they were pretty much lepers in their towns. Sin eaters were not allowed to look anyone in the eyes as they walked down the street or enter a home, and no one wanted to go near them or talk to them. For even though they were doing an important job, people believed sin eaters became evil due to all the sins they ingested. Often, when they were finished, the families who hired them would chase them out of their homes by throwing stones and bricks at them. It was a lonely, thankless life.
The idea of taking away sin upon death isn't a new one. People have confessed to priests on their deathbeds, they've gone to confession, and they've used animal substitutes to transfer the sin. It's people's way of getting into heaven. In some West African cults, if a person is believed to be targeted for death by the gods for whichever sin they may have committed, an animal was used to transfer those sins into. Once the sins were successfully put into the animal, it was sacrificed to the gods and buried as if it were the human sinner. This was meant to sort of trick the gods into thinking the sinner was dead and thus would leave him alone. The same sort of sin offering was performed in ancient Judea as well. It was called the hatat. However, instead of transferring the sin, the guilty person laid their hands on the head of the sacrificial animal, asking God to forgive them. After which the animal was killed and its blood was sprinkled on the altar, so the holy bond with God was once again established through the consecrated blood of the animal sacrifice, and the sinner was purified of sin.
But what happens if a person dies before they have a chance to confess their sins? In the Middle Ages, this was something the church took very seriously and came up with some strange ideas on how to fix it. One such idea was the practice of buying and selling indulgences, which basically means the church sold forgiveness. If someone died unconfessed, family members could buy an indulgence to get them into heaven quickly. When paying for sin eaters became more fashionable than paying for indulgences, the church stepped in and made sin eating a crime. What's worse is that the poor sin eaters couldn't even go to the church for confession and forgiveness. If they did, they would be executed. That didn't stop people, however, and the practice continued in secret.
Yeah, sin eaters actually were on the job until the early 1900s. Like, I think the last known sin eater died in like 1917 or something like that. is crazy. In America, in England, I think the last one over there was died in 1906 or so. I could have that totally wrong, but it was sometime in the early 1900s. And to me, still, the early 1900s wasn't that long ago. So it's crazy to think that Sin Eaters were still around doing this and people were still hiring them to do this. But then again, is it that crazy? I mean, people do a lot of crazy things when people die and to, say prayers and do all these things. I mean, maybe the church does, I don't even know, does the church sell indulgences? Can we get an indulgence for people? Do they do that anymore? I don't think they do.
No, they don't do that anymore. Because I think after, I think they stopped doing things like that at some point because they were getting in trouble for charging all of these different things, you basically go in there and you pay them money, oh, I didn't get to go to church today, but here's a couple pennies or something like that. Yeah. So, I mean, I think people were kind of starting to get tired of these different taxes and things that the church would put on their lives. So that was probably definitely came out of fashion, and the Sin Eaters kind of continued because of that, because maybe the indulgences, I don't know exactly when they went away, but I would imagine pretty early on. I mean, that was one of the complaints of Martin Luther. He was in the 14th and 15th century. Yeah, that was a split from the church though. So the church still continued on with it, but people started leaving because of it. So the indulgences probably last a little bit longer, but there's probably some level of reform after Martin Luther. That brings us to the end of our episode. You can follow the Unusual History of Everything podcast on Instagram at The Unusual History of Everything, and on Facebook at The Unusual History of Everything podcast. And find our show notes on www.musecuratorial.com. The Unusual History of Everything is written, produced, and directed by Melanie Dellis and Karen Lisi.
New episodes air every Tuesday on all podcast outlets. Be sure to subscribe to us so you never miss an episode and leave us a review. You can also see photos from our episodes and more on our website, Instagram, and Facebook. Thanks for listening. I'm Melanie Dellis.
And I'm Karen Lisi, your host for The Unusual History of Everything. Da, 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 da.